I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, and I'm in Washington, D.C. for the Public Citizen Annual Gala, along with Hannah, who's also here. My co-host David Feldman. You're still in New York.
I think I'm in New York.
Just look out the window, you'll tell. And of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Well, a lot of this program is going to treat some of your comments and suggestions and questions.
In addition to that, Ralph, on today's program, we present you with another chapter in our ongoing series promoting consumer advocacy. In particular, those people who have spent their careers in the trenches fighting to protect our health and safety. One of those exemplars of civic stamina is our guest today, Jackie Gillan. Jackie Gillan served as president of Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, a coalition working together to reduce motor vehicle crashes, save lives, and prevent injuries through the adoption of federal and state laws, policies, and programs. We'll speak to her about the early days of the auto safety movement when she worked alongside Ralph, Joan Claybrook, and other safety advocates to set up the protections that we take for granted, and how their decades-long dedication to this work has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. That's the first half of the show. In the second half, we're going back to our roots, old school, free form. Just going to be Ralph and the rest of the team talking about what's going on in the world, answering your questions, and commenting on your feedback about recent episodes. And it wouldn't be a Ralph Nader Radio Hour if we didn't check in with our indomitable corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk to someone who made your safety her life's work. David?
Jackie Gillan is past president of Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, a coalition working together to reduce motor vehicle crashes, save lives, and prevent injuries through the adoption of federal and state laws, policies, and programs. Ms. Gillan has held senior policy positions for 3 state transportation agencies, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the U.S. Senate. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jackie Gillan.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Jackie Gillan. Welcome again. We've been working together on auto safety on and off for many years. Listeners might be interested in how all this got started. When I was a law student at Harvard Law School, and I started writing a third-year paper on unsafe auto design and the lack of regulation, a Liberty Mutual Insurance Company project came to my attention in Boston. So I went down and met with the vice president for engineering, a crusty person, but very warm-hearted. And he took me to a garage and he showed me a giant 4-door Chevrolet, which he had refigured to make more crash worthiness an aspect of its engineering design and make it safer. So he had things like collapsible steering columns, seat belts, which weren't in cars at that time. He had rollover bars. He had side protection. He had head restraints. He had padded dash panels. Dozens of little things like that that could make crashes survivable. People would just walk away without injuries. And I was fascinated. He guided me through one device after another. And I asked him, why is he doing this? Why is Liberty Mutual doing this? It offends the auto industry. He said, because it's our duty to engage in loss prevention. If we have safer cars, there are fewer injuries and fatalities. And if there are fewer injuries and fatalities, the claims on our insurance companies are reduced and they make more profit. So the idea of loss prevention stuck in my mind year after year. And I learned that, for example, industrial boilers in the 19th century factories used to blow up. And the insurance companies hired engineers, and they would say to these factories, we're not covering you with an insurance policy unless you meet certain safety standards and inspection standards for your boilers. And it worked. In fact, there was one company called the Hartford Boiler Insurance Company. And so fast forward, we can see that from time to time, insurance companies will give people discounts if they can prove they're not smokers, or if they can prove that they use some safety feature, whether it's homeowner insurance or health insurance. Well, in 1988, with Harvey Rosenfield and others, we went up and down the state of California and won a statewide referendum to regulate the property casualty insurance companies. They spent $80 million. We spent $2 million, and we beat them on referendum day. And over $150 billion have been saved already for California policyholders, according to Robert Hunter, the former federal insurance commissioner and an insurance actuary. And out of that, some of the insurance companies, Jackie, felt they had to put out a better face to the public. And Joan Claybrook and you and others got together, and we encouraged them to join a joint project with consumer leaders and start the Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, based in Washington, D.C. And that's the rough picture. Now, what has happened has been a spectacular success. On your 32nd year anniversary, you have put out a report, which is the return on investment generated by advocates' safety successes is extraordinary and growing appreciably. And in other words, the insurance companies that help fund the advocates are supporting all kinds of safety laws that reduce death, injury, property damage, and that accrues to their bottom line. So with that rather extended introduction, tell us about this report that's come out and the work of advocates, because I don't think many listeners or many people in the country know about this extraordinary implementing institution of the most important ethical principle for the insurance companies to follow. They should be sentinels of safety. They should be great life-saving institutions.
You're absolutely right, Ralph. And I think it is very interesting that our origins were from a very contentious battle out in California. And after that battle was over, I think some of the leading lights in the insurance industry got together and decided that there had to be a better way forward. And that's when they came to some of the consumer leaders like Joan Claybrook and said, well, let's work together. When you were the NHTSA administrator in the Carter administration, they worked with Joan and others to promote the airbag standard, and they wanted to continue that effort. Now, at the time in 1988, there were 47,000 highway deaths, and I think everyone was quickly realizing that slick slogans and public education programs were not going to bring down deaths and injuries. So they brought advocates together. We have equal number of consumer and insurance board members. And every year we put together a very comprehensive program where we work on passing state traffic safety laws, as well as getting motor vehicle safety and truck safety regulations implemented. And it is a tough battle, believe me, because we are fighting some of the most well-entrenched and well-financed industry. Now, what advocates did with this report that we just released is that I think everybody realizes the public health and safety benefits, but I don't think people really focus that frequently on what the economic benefits are of reducing highway deaths and injuries. And they are, as you said, in the billions of dollars when you prevent even one death. So advocates, unlike a lot of safety organizations, we are a lobbying organization. So we lobby in state legislatures and we lobby in Congress, and we push the Department of Transportation to issue these motor vehicle safety regulations. Unfortunately, we have found that getting a safety standard out of DOT is all but impossible unless you get Congress to mandate it. And I will tell you that, the combination of consumers and insurance companies, I think, and I have been there since the beginning, have really helped us make these issues bipartisan. And I know at a time where Congress is really split, there are these, divisions there. I think that advocates has proven that we can come together. In fact, some of our strongest allies in Congress have been, Republicans from deep red states, as well as Democrats in deep blue states. What the report shows, and if you like, I can just go through some of the major findings of it.
Yeah, could you go through, especially what's on the front cover?
Right. So some of the major findings is that since 1989, advocates' efforts have resulted in the enactment of nearly 500 state traffic safety laws. And I don't want to in any way, leave the impression that we're doing it alone. We go in and we work with all kinds of coalitions. And some of the strongest voices for us on our safety agenda have been the victims of these crashes, who lend and share their own personal stories of loss to get things enacted. We have been involved in more than 15 significant motor vehicle safety standards, and our legislative successes in state capitals and in Congress have resulted in more than 215,000 lives saved from 1989 to 2021 at a total cost savings of more than $2 trillion. There have been reductions in government programs like Medicare and Medicaid because of these savings. It has resulted in substantial savings to the auto insurance industry and reduced insurance claims and processing costs totaling about $1 trillion. And the bottom line is that auto insurers help generate at least $1,250 in cost savings for every dollar invested in advocates. And that's really a conservative viewpoint. So yes, we have been incredibly successful. And as I said, nearly every single safety standard on your car has our fingerprints on it and battle scars for the staff fighting in Congress and in the agency to try to get these rulemakings finished. In fact, we had a major victory about 3 weeks ago where the U.S. Department of Transportation released a rule that we have been fighting for years now, which will require automatic emergency braking on all new cars beginning in 2029. And Ralph, that's going to be a game changer, like airbags were.
Well, these figures, listeners, that Jackie Gillan has been talking about were the result of a report by Dr. Ted Miller, a principal research scientist for the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation. How can they get this report? It's online, I think. It came out in January.
Yes, if you go to our website, it's www.saferoads.org. And we also have a wealth of other information for your listeners on our website. For instance, every year we publish the state roadmap report. And what it is it's a very intensive effort. We look at 50 state traffic safety laws and we rate the states on how well they're doing in passing 12 or 13 of key laws. And these are laws having to do with occupant protection, seatbelt use, motorcycle helmet use, child safety laws, impaired driving, teen driving, distracted driving, and other areas that are major contributors to motor vehicle crashes. And what we do is we list the states and we look at the laws that they have and the ones that they're missing, and then we rank them. And it's a really good source of information for people to know sort of how their state is doing and what some of the gaps are in their traffic safety laws.
Jackie, I found it very interesting to see which insurance companies have funded advocates for highway and auto safety and which ones are staying on the sidelines. For example, Geico, a giant auto insurer, just reported, apart from their reserves, they've got $180 billion in cash with a B, and they are not participants in advocates for highway and auto safety, whereas State Farm and Allstate are. Can you name some of the companies that have supported and continue to be part of the funding of advocates?
Well, you mentioned Liberty Mutual, your first visit with them, and they were one of the founding insurance companies that helped to set up advocates. We also have State Farm, as you mentioned, Allstate. We have Farmers Insurance. We have Nationwide. We have some smaller companies like NJM Insurance and Selective. We also have two of the major insurance trade associations and the professional insurance agents that are members. So yes, are we, like every single public interest organization, we're always struggling and could use more money, and we're recruiting other insurance companies. We have made some progress. I think this report not only shows the benefits of passing these traffic safety laws and getting these motor vehicle safety standards implemented, but it also will help us show the insurance industry that there's a bottom line benefit to supporting these efforts.
Now, here's the stunning figure you're about to hear, listeners. All this activity that Jackie Gillan has been talking about, all the multiple extraordinary consequences for health, safety, and property damage minimization, comes from a group called Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety and its budget. Now, Tim Cook of Apple makes $2 million a week, not counting benefits, $2 million a week. Now, tell our listeners what your latest annual budget is to produce all these extraordinary activities.
Our budget is about $2.2 million. But circling back to some of your previous guests on this program, where you're talking about the dedication of staff to the public interest movement, we're really lucky because, as I said, we have a very dedicated staff of 8 people. We have people that have been with advocates for a long time. And I think they're instilled with that same sort of public interest desire to, make this a better world and make this a safer world. So we're really lucky in that sense. And we also, as I said, depend on the help of others. And you, Ralph, have, I know on this program, interviewed some of those victims that have lost loved ones in crashes. And they are incredible, believable, and, really, really strong advocates for our safety program. So whenever I'm going up against the trucking industry or the auto industry, I always say there's nothing better than bringing out a victim who can talk from their heart about their own personal loss because of something the auto industry or the trucking industry didn't do to make a safer vehicle. And they have been tremendous allies of ours.
Again, same problem. The mainstream press doesn't pay much attention to advocates' work, even though they and with Joan Clayburgh were almost single-handedly responsible for blocking a massive lobbying effort by the autonomous car companies to deregulate autonomous cars, which passed through the House, but was fortunately blocked a few years ago in the Senate by the efforts of people like Jackie Gillan and Joan Clayburgh. A budget about what Tim Cook makes every week, plus maybe a day. So something to ponder, listeners, and I want to give Steve and others a chance to pitch in here. Steve?
Jackie, why would insurance companies not participate? What do they tell you?
Well, usually they don't give us the reason, they just will say, no, we're not interested. And I also think that there's the issue, Steve, of the free ride. They don't have to join, and we're still going to continue pushing for these national auto safety standards and these safety laws in states. And I think that's probably typical of, PERGs and everybody else, people who benefit don't always contribute to it. And I think it's that free ride issue where they feel like it's going to get done anyway. And, I think at first when Advocates was formed, there was a little hesitation in the insurance industry over, oh my goodness, look at these consumer people. Can we really trust them? Can we really work with them? And I think in addition to 35 years of chalking up some really, major safety successes, it's been interesting the kind of relationships that have developed across the board table that have worked on other issues together, and that kind of respect where people get to know each other. And all of a sudden, those statements or those descriptions of, oh, how can you work with these people sort of fade away because, we're all sort of working for the same goal.
Well, if any listeners are policyholders of Geico, let your insurance agent in Geico know that you would like Geico to spend a modest amount, perhaps the cost of a single-page ad in the New York Times, by becoming a participant in Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety. David?
The people in San Francisco said we don't want self-driving cars, so the auto industry went to Sacramento and passed superseding laws that disallow the people of San Francisco from saying you can't have self-driving cars on our roads. Are the American people ever going to be consulted on this? And what does the polling show? Do Americans want self-driving cars and self-driving trucks?
No, that is a simple answer. No, they do not want them. In fact, Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety has conducted several public opinion polls, and the public is very skeptical. And there's a reason to be skeptical because this is unproven, unregulated, unsafe technology. And as Ralph mentioned, a few years ago, legislation was racing through Congress that pretty much gave the auto and tech industry carte blanche to develop these technologies and make us all guinea pigs without any sort of regulation at all. I think what has happened is the experiment in San Francisco has been a complete fiasco. And I think that Tesla is the car manufacturer that keeps on giving in terms of showing the problems and, where people have died because of that. So the public does not support it. One of the questions that we put on our public opinion poll, which I thought had an interesting response, was, would you feel more comfortable if there were government standards regulating and setting minimum performance standards? And the overwhelming response was yes. So the agency, the Department of Transportation, is really MIA on this. They're getting around now. They're just recently had some recalls and they're collecting data. but they are really behind the eight ball in issuing these minimum performance standards. But allowing the auto industry to, try to, ignore existing regulations. I mean, they have to meet them, but they should be out there. And I think Tesla is a good example of putting this technology in cars that hasn't been reviewed thoroughly by DOT, or that they have set minimum performance standards. And that's what regulations do. That's what I was talking about, the automatic emergency braking. Right now, that technology is in a lot of cars that we're driving, but there are no minimum standards. So some of the systems work well and some of them don't work very well at all. And we need those DOT standards so that everybody playing by the same rules and meets those standards. And that's the only way that these self-driving technologies will ever be fully accepted by the public, if there's, some measurement and requirements on them before they introduce them to, the public and make us all guinea pigs in this experiment.
Hannah?
I know we're short on time and Francesco has a question, so I'm going to yield my time to Francesco.
Hi, Jackie. Pedestrian deaths have reached a 40-year high. Are regulators, legislators, or the industry taking this crisis seriously, and what are they doing about it?
Well, that's a really good question, because last year, 7,000 pedestrians died, and that was one of the highest numbers since, I think, the early 80s. I am hopeful. It was mentioned about the infrastructure bill, and I think that there are many cities and states that are looking at how to protect pedestrians. I mean, on the one hand, we have these contradictory goals. We want people to get out of their cars, but then we don't want to make it safe for them to walk. So we need to deal with that. And the other thing we need to deal with is speed. One of the areas I'm hopeful is, again, referring to this automatic emergency braking standard. The DOT standard does require a pedestrian element to that. And that's going to be really helpful in terms of making sure this technology recognizes pedestrians. And that should, hopefully reduce some of those pedestrian deaths, especially, if people are distracted and not looking, and all of a sudden there's a pedestrian crossing the street. So there are some steps in that direction, but we need to do more, certainly.
Well, we're out of time. I'm sure some of our listeners would like to hear about rising auto insurance premiums that they're paying and the rebates that auto insurance companies haven't given back to their policyholders following the decline during the early months of COVID of automobile driving mileage. But that'll be for another time. In the meantime, before we conclude, Jackie Gillan, once more, tell people how they can obtain a print report or see online this remarkable summary of 32 years of work by the Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety.
Well, they can go to our website. The website address is www.saferoads.org, and that's plural, safe roads, SAFEROADS.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie Gillan. Keep up the good work. People should expect their insurance companies to be sentinels for their safety and health. It helps their bottom line, and of course, it helps the people all over our country. Thank you, Jackie Gillan.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Jackie Gillan. We will link to Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we crack open the mailbag. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, June 14, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A low-calorie sweetener, xylitol, used in many reduced sugar foods and consumer products such as gum and toothpaste, may be linked to nearly twice the risk of heart attacks, stroke, and death in people who consume the highest levels of the sweetener. A new study has found. That's according to a report from CNN. We gave healthy volunteers a typical drink with xylitol to see how high the levels would get, and they went up 1,000-fold, said senior study author Stanley Hazen, director of the Center for Cardiovascular Diagnostics and Prevention at the Cleveland Clinic. When you eat sugar, your glucose levels may go up 10% or 20%, but it doesn't go up 1,000-fold, said Hazen. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, Ralph, and the rest of the team. We're going to dive into the mailbag in a moment, but first, Ralph, you wanted to talk about the Capitol Hill Citizen and a little event that occurred in relation to that. What's going on?
Yeah, well, the new capitalcitizen.com print only is available, just came out, and it's full of information that our listeners really would like to have, knowing where they're coming from and their feedback, which we're going to go into with many, many of your recent comments and questions, listeners. But on page 1, I've written one of the most unlikely ways to buy back Congress. And as you know, for $3.5 billion in campaign contributions, the corporations get back trillions of dollars of goodies, corporate welfare, subsidies, giveaways, handouts, bailouts, tax evasions and avoidances, tiny law enforcement budgets against the corporate crime wave, and so on and so forth. It's the greatest bargain ever in terms of investment in the United States, and it's inimical to the American people. So I want to reverse that. I want to flip it and say an average of $25 per eligible voter would buy back the Congress. It would basically say, we're going to give you what you would have raised, but you have to commit to raising no money from commercial sources, etc. And in the second stage, after some of these people in Congress have been replaced or persuaded, then the whole area of campaign finance reform gets reformed from the bottom up. And so it's a way of people financing the Congress instead of public financing Congress, which has to go through a Congress who's already sold out to corporate financing. So I'd like you to read that, listeners. There's also a page 1 story, Citizens Push Back Against AIPAC Dominance. There's a new, very factual group that has started called Track AIPAC, which produces on their website a lot of how AIPAC distributes its campaign money, how it develops power over so many members of Congress. Then there's another page 1 story on the Pentagon having offices on Capitol Hill, separation of power to the wind. They actually have offices in the Rayburn building, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and they have majors and other high-ranking Pentagon people assigned, one to each member of Congress, like the drug companies, just swarming all over the place, and they often are involved in Armed Services Committee work, House and Senate, where you walk in, you think you're talking to a congressional staff, you're talking to a temporary assignee to learn about Congress coming out of the Pentagon. So you'll like that. There's a rather amazing article by Russell Mokhiber, the editor. What he did is he took off from the House censoring Rashida Tlaib for simply retweeting a critical commentary on Israel regarding Gaza. So he found 10 of the worst, most vicious comments by members of Congress that were never censored, like finish them off. I don't mind if Israel makes the rubble bounce in Gaza. That was Senator Tom Cotton. Another one, finish them off. That was Senator Lindsey Graham. So he has their pictures, he has their comment, and he asks the question, why haven't they been censored? They're advocating genocide, not just transferring commentary that's pro-Palestinian by Rashida Tlaib, the congresswoman from Michigan. And then Bruce Fein weighs in with an article on 10 dying laws that are not being enforced, from provisions of the Constitution, like the War Declare Law, to other statutes, to give people an insight in why is Congress enacting laws that they have no interest in seeing enforced by the executive branch. I did an article on the lethal incommunicado arrogance of Congress. We've talked about this before, where they don't bother responding. Serious letters, nothing, not even a formal acknowledgement in the most case. And when they do send a form letter, it's not responsive to the letter sent by the citizen. It's like two ships passing in the night. And they never used to do that years ago. They would at least have some courtesy and go through a process of responding, but no more. That's how much of a cocoon in the hands of corporations Congress has become. And we have an article on the Postmaster General DeJoy's ruination of the U.S. Postal Service. The first-class stamp is now taking its greatest single jump from 68 cents to 73 cents in July. And, he's raising rates, reducing service, and doing everything he can to set the U.S. Postal Service up for failure so the corporation can say, well, we can take it over. We can corporatize it. And the Democrats control the Board of Governors under Biden, and they won't lift a finger to send into retirement Mr. DeJoy, who's bringing so much misery to users of the Postal Service, and is a Trump appointee. He was a big supporter of Trump. Would the Trump people ever let a Democratic head of a major agency stay on? Of course not.
Why do you think that is?
We've been trying to find out, and we can't find the answer to that question other than that DeJoy is a very clever politician, and the Democrats don't think they can get a replacement through the Republican opposition in the Senate that's any better. That's all we have right now. He does curry favor with some of the postal unions on some of their issues. He's a great divide and rule political charmer. So whatever it is, he still controls the post office. You want to get the forever stamp, people, before it goes up a nickel, it's still available. So those are some of the articles. We have a realistic picture of people under the rubble in Gaza under the subtitle Biden's Bombs. And that's exactly what's happening. Biden talks about peace and humanitarian aid and two-state solution, but his deeds are to send endless supplies of weapons of mass destruction, including weapons that are used in sheer total violation of the Geneva Conventions and international law as the starvation increases in Gaza. And by the way, 2 UN agencies have stated that by mid-July, unless the situation changes, 1 million Palestinians in Gaza will be at the highest level of starvation. What do you think that means?
Wow.
That means they're either dead, dying, or forever permanently damaged. And all Biden has to do is to call Netanyahu and say, Netanyahu, you've been pushing me around long enough. We're paying for hundreds of trucks full of food, water, medicine, and other necessities at the border to go into Gaza. They will be draped with American flags, and they're going in as of now. Do you understand that? And if you want to use F-16s to stop those trucks, you got another problem, Mr. Netanyahu. He doesn't even have the courage to do that, and doesn't even have the courage to demand that Netanyahu open the border in Gaza for American journalists who, along with Western journalists and Israeli journalists, have been barred for years from going into that enclave, which is only twice the size of the District of Columbia, with 2.3 million people suffering under an illegal, stifling embargo before October 7th, long before. And you won't even do that. So that's why he appears weak to more and more Americans, and he may well pay that price on November 5th to the horror of a Trump presidency. This is how far he goes in his obeisance to the right-wing, violent, genocidal political coalition that has hijacked the Israeli society.
That's a great point, Ralph, because for a man who is on both sides of the aisle considered weak and, by virtue of his age and his processing, that he would allow himself to be kind of Netanyahu's Sancho Panza. He must fear the Israeli lobby or the Republican response to, for the election more than he fears coming across as, like second banana to Netanyahu.
And not defending the American interest, because the blowback on American democracy of this Israeli conflict is getting deeper and deeper, crushing free speech, not just on campuses, people getting fired, suspended, events being canceled all over the country because they dare simply talk about Palestinian rights and the need for a peaceful settlement against the imperial domination of the West Bank and Gaza for decades by the Israeli government. And You can imagine the impact it's having on the military budget. The Congress just whooped through $26 billion for Israel. $26 billion. You can't find a fraction of that for neonatal care, for child hunger in the U.S. You can't find a fraction for the dire necessities of farm workers in the country, for people who don't have health insurance, for the people who work day and night and don't have daycare and have two jobs that they can't put together for decent livelihood. And they're shipping all this money. Now, $9 billion of the 26 is designated for humanitarian aid. Really? Run by the Israeli right-wing government? Where is that going to end up, you think? $9 billion. There's going to be no congressional oversight. So what some citizen groups are now doing, Steve, is pushing for something that hasn't happened since 1948, and that is getting Congress to invite prominent Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates of long standing, many years. In Israel, they're former generals, mayors of major cities, heads of the equivalent of the FBI and CIA, who despise Netanyahu, as 3 out of 4 Israelis do now, despise Netanyahu, who is under indictment for criminal corruption by Israeli prosecutors, which he's been trying to fend off, which is why he wants to prolong the genocidal war in Palestine.
Ralph, let me ask you this question. Put yourself in Biden's position. You're president of the United States with all of the pressures and competing interests that you have to sort of balance there. How would you frame a response that would be a moral response to what's going on in Gaza while also taking into consideration the election and the risk of alienating a fair amount of Jewish voters? How would you frame that if you were in his position?
First of all, a majority of Jewish Americans are against what's going on over there, number one. And the tide is shifting. We can see the excellent work being done by Jewish Voice for Peace in these times. What Biden has to do is really quite simple. He took an oath to obey the laws of the land. There are 6 federal statutes that condition the shipment of military weapons to foreign countries, including Israel, that are being violated with his unconditional shipping of all the weapons Israel wants. So all he has to do is say, I have an oath of office. These laws are being violated. We're going to enforce the laws. If you don't like these laws, then repeal them. But right now, I'm going to enforce them because month after month, I've been warning Netanyahu in our telephone conversations about these violations, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore. Number 2, to finish what I was just saying before you interjected, Steve, he can lead the way in inviting leading Palestinian, prominent Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates who have been blocked since 1948 and never have been given an opportunity to testify before congressional committees in the House and Senate. Imagine that. That's what AIPAC has done. They have stifled the voices of former mayors of Israeli cities, former heads of the Israeli FBI and CIA, former generals, leading intellectuals, and academics who despise the Netanyahu regime, as 3 out of 4 Israelis do now, and he can get them invited to Congress to testify. The third is he can object to this grotesque invitation for an ongoing war criminal, Netanyahu, that was extended by the leaders of both parties in Congress to address Congress on July 24th. And he can say, this is nothing you do in the middle of a war, and he's got the clout to turn around Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, who went along with Speaker Johnson and Senator McConnell in one of the most notorious duets of congressional surrender in our history. So that's the way. And then, of course, in the meantime, he can cut off arms shipments because these laws are being violated, and they say you don't send weapons to any country that violates these laws. He's got to stand up here. President Eisenhower in 1956, witnessing the British, French, and Israeli aircraft bombing Egypt sent a message to them. You're going to stop now. No ifs, ands, or buts. And they stopped. Even Ronald Reagan said no to Israel on a matter that offended his sensibilities, and they conceded. So they understand who their patron is in North America, but the White House is not using the leverage on behalf of the interests of the American people and its own democratic society that's being overridden by this continuing suppression and misallocation of taxpayer dollars. By the way, the last thing I want to say about the Capitol Citizen, which you can get by making a donation of $5 or more if you wish by first-class mail. You'll get it right away. Just go to capitolcitizen.com. If you want to get more for your own circle of citizen discussion, you can do so. And I just want to tell a story, Steve, that a few days ago, Congressman Mfume from Baltimore, former head of the NAACP, saw a copy of the Capitol Citizen on his desk, and he started reading through it. And when he finished, he called in his chief of staff, and he said, "This paper is a must for our staff. Please order 10 copies right away." It's only in print, by the way. So that's a good sign that this paper, which is delivered right from the print shop to every member of Congress and congressional committees, is starting to take hold. So read about it, people, and learn how you can be a Capitol citizen yourself on Capitol Hill from where you live, work, back home.
That's a great inroad you've got there. And to remind everybody, go to capitolhillcitizen.com, order your copy right away, order some for your friends. I get it every time it comes out, and it really is 40 pages of information and news and commentary that you don't get anywhere else. That's capitolhillcitizen.com. All right, very good. Now let's dive into the mailbag. This comment was on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack page, comes from Larry N. And Larry says, poverty is a symptom, not the cause of global poverty. And this is referring to Reverend William Barber's appearance on our show last week. And Larry says, fighting the statistics of poverty is treating symptoms, not the root causes of global poverty. Who is deliberately impoverishing the global population? Answer, the parasitic ownership class. Ralph, do you have any comments on that from Larry N?
Well, certainly. I mean, the world can grow enough and produce enough so everybody has a decent standard of living. And there are countries in Western Europe, for example, who back in the 1950s enacted legislation that abolished poverty. They had all kinds of social safety nets. We didn't. Larry's right on point. It's a political power concentration laced with commercial greed problem that leads to all this poverty. Okay.
Ralph, when they take the measure of a nation's GDP, is it measured the same way in each country? Is America's GDP the same yardstick as, say, Germany's GDP?
Yeah, they use the same commercial statistics. They don't talk about distributional GDP, just the aggregate output of goods and services, etc. There is, however, a strong vein of opposition to this among progressive economists who say you not only have to talk about production output, you have to talk about how's it distributed among the people. Is it concentrated heavily in the top 1% and so on? But it hasn't gone official yet, although there are cracks in the aggregate quantification of GDP among some Western countries, and we hope that they'll have an alternative GDP that focuses on distributional economics.
All right, as we continue on, this is also comments in relation to the show we did last week with the Poor People Campaign and Reverend William Barber. Someone who goes by the sobriquet DBKNY wrote, another interesting show that mainstream media doesn't comment about. The largest voting bloc in America today, poor people. If this group was united as a bloc, maybe Obama would have kept his campaign promise to have universal Medicare for all instead of Obamacare. What about that, Ralph?
Well, that's true. There are 120 million eligible voters predicted not to vote in November. So imagine if a few millions of those came out they would make the difference because a lot of these races are close. And when they come out like that, they're giving the winning candidate a mandate. And that's what we need. Not just votes, but votes with a mandate. Universal health insurance, living wage, all the other long overdue reforms that have been accepted by Canada and Western Europe countries, and including places like Taiwan and Japan, I might add.
Well, Ralph, this is a comment that came in, I think, on our YouTube page in relation to that, where someone said, I'm too poor to join the Poor People's Campaign. The implication being that they can't take time off from work, how many other jobs they have, to actually mobilize in a way that people who have more time on their hands or can afford to do. I mean, isn't that really the structural issue here?
Well, I read it differently, Steve. I read it that the person's too poor to travel to Washington, where the Poor People's Campaign kicks off in a few weeks. And my answer to the listener is the Poor People's Campaign starts in Washington, but it's going to go all over the country. So go to their website and see when it comes to your community or near to your community. And you can always support it by just talking it up. And if you're online, send it to your followers or your network or your friends.
And S. Lowry writes, wish that someone with integrity and confidence of the public would recommend a candidate to write in on the Democratic ballot. We would then have someone to be glad to vote for. Things cannot be any worse. Perhaps such a mass voting event would carry weight.
Yeah, well, S. Lowry, you make a good point. I'm all in favor of write-in votes, except for one or two states like Oregon and perhaps Oklahoma. They do total them up, and you can write in anybody. And it's a way of protesting and not staying home and not be counted at all. I wear a cap from time to time that says on the top of the cap, write-in votes. So if you can't stand who's on the ballot, you can write in your vote. But remember, there is a Green Party, and there is a very good agenda by the Green Party, and they're going to be on most states, and you can always consider that. We shouldn't be trapped by a two-party oligopoly, which confronts us with this either-or choice every 4 years, seemingly getting worse.
I remember, Ralph, in An Unreasonable Man, which we've previously talked about, you telling me, and it's in the movie, that when you keep voting for the least worst, it keeps getting worse. And so there seems to be a short-term problem here and a long-term problem. In the short term, it's like always the most important election of our time, and we can't afford to vote our conscience. And in the short term, they're probably right. We're facing that once again. But in the long term, it seems like the reason we're at this point is because we have voted for the least worst. And over the long run, it has gotten worse and worse until we're confronted with this proto-fascist Donald Trump.
That's why it's good to start local political parties where you can actually elect people on the first or second round, because there are tens of thousands of local elected officials in this country that have no opposition in the election. They run unopposed. So you're immediately a contender for a city council or any of the other committees that are elected, depending on the municipality, the zoning commission, for example, or the health commission. So think about that. That's like bottom-up change. And it sends a very powerful signal to Washington to see more and more people running for office and getting elected with the demand for a conscientious government.
This next comment comes from a longtime listener, Don Harris, who has been commenting on our page for probably almost since the beginning. David, why don't you do the honors on this one?
This is from Don Harris. While Bishop Barber means well, voting based on promises of future action has not and will not achieve our goals. The close elections he refers to that could be won are not close at all. No matter who wins these elections, it will be a politician that is controlled by big money, which means that election has been lost 100% to zero to the big money interests. His list of questions he wants politicians to answer with promises of future action while campaigning have already been answered with a resounding no. by any politician who takes big money to run their campaign. The first demand needs to be that politicians run small donor campaigns. Then we look at how the politicians will answer the rest of his questions.
Well, that's fine. You sort of contradict yourself beneficially, Don Harris. You say that promises a future actor has not and will not achieve his or our goals, but you have an exception, which is promise take small donor campaigns. But you get a foothold. A lot of these members of Congress would vote progressive if they had a bigger input of progressive voters who were the sine qua non of their election. So you start out with addressing significant proportions of Congress who mean well but feel trapped by how they were elected and with what money. And if you begin changing that, their existing progressive instincts will deploy on the floor of the Senate and the House. So you got to have a foothold, and that is what Bishop Barber is talking about. Also, let's face it, Trump is fascist. The Democrats are autocrats. That's the choice you have. And given that Trump has been openly saying he's going to destroy the regulatory process for health and safety, he's going to cut more corporate taxes and the taxes of the rich like himself, he's going to disable the civil service in Congress, he's going to bloat the military budget even more than Biden has, he's going to attack labor unions, which he's always attacked when he was a failed businessman in New York City. And he is going to do what he said in July of 2019, quote, with Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president, end quote. Bruce Fein called that comment an impeachable offense in and of itself. So that's what Bishop Barber is basically saying. And he's not saying don't vote for a third party. He's saying get out there and vote and demand what your vote is intended to require our elected representatives to do. In other words, attach your vote to very powerful issues and reforms. You can start with a living wage and universal health care.
Anna?
This question comes to us from Richard Stevenson. He says, hi, in your interview with Dr. Postal, April 27th, 2024, you characterized the Ukraine crisis as being analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis, in that the Clinton administration was aggressively advancing NATO onto Russian borders. But the Ukrainians surrendered their nuclear weapons to Russia for the guarantee of non-aggression by Russia in a negotiation mediated by the Clinton administration. Are these things I've stated not true? If they are true, are you going to issue a correction?
Well, Mr. Stevenson, let me respond to you. First of all, when Gorbachev was negotiating what turned out to be the end of the Soviet Union, and he spun off the various republics like Ukraine and Kazakhstan and the Baltic states, so on, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, there was more than an implied assurance that NATO would not move into Eastern Europe as a military alliance and sign up these countries and threaten the Russian border, as two German armies did with 50 million Russian fatalities in two world wars. We have to take that into consideration. The analogy that was drawn by Theodore Postal with Cuba was the following, in that the Russians were sending nuclear weapons to Cuba, and we were moving to almost risk a global nuclear war with the Soviet Union and Khrushchev, who was running it at the time. The analogy is that NATO, with nuclear weapons in tow, as well as other conventional weapons, moved right up to the Russian border. And what Mr. Postal was saying, how do you expect Russia, regardless of who the leader was, Putin or otherwise, to react to that kind of blatant threat and disregard of an implied assurance that that would never happen? George Kennan, one of the greatest analysts of Soviet-U.S. relations, called the move of NATO to signing up countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, was one of the greatest blunders in American diplomatic military history. Well, now you can see the bitter fruits of that aggressive move. And I might add, you're right on Ukraine. They did give up nuclear But Ukraine is like a pawn here between the NATO powers and Putin's Russia. The main concern that Russia has is U.S. soldiers close to the border in alliance with bordering countries' military and the ability to use weapons of mass destruction. If the shoe was on the other foot and they were doing to us on the Canadian or Mexican border, you can imagine what the reaction would be, regardless of who would be in the White House.
The reaction to that, Ralph, because the reaction to that would be Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, so he's not going to stop at Ukraine. And that strikes me as old Cold War domino theory stuff, which didn't pan out at that time either.
Putin is presiding over a weak economy the size of Texas in terms of GDP. He doesn't have enough soldiers even for Ukraine. They're emptying the Russian prisons, including women prisoners now, if they will serve in Ukraine. The casualties are horrendous. He's not going into any other country, even if he wanted to. The pressure on him coming from the spreading poverty and the anger about the casualties in Ukraine is going to restrain him no matter how much of a dictator he thinks he is.
Thank you for those questions and comments. Keep them coming on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack page or on our YouTube channel. We will try to respond more often. But as of now, I want to thank our guest today, Jackie Gillan. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up. We'll have a lot more of your listener questions and a lot more conversation with Ralph in the Wrap Up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Try to get more radio stations to pick up the show in your community, listeners.
Listen to me, people. Do you understand?